The Octarine Tree, a podcast exploring the meaning of ecology, spirit and human relationship. From southwestern Australia, I'm your host, Byron Joel. G'day, mob. Welcome back to the Octarine Tree podcast. Wow, I just got finished interviewing my friend Mark Jones. You're about to hear a really interesting take on things from a really interesting chap. Mark Jones is a filmmaker who lives in Broome, Western Australia. He's been living and working extensively in the Kimberley region of Western Australia for 27 years. Started out as a camera operator with the adventure filmmaker Malcolm Douglas that most Australians will know of. His curiosity led him into the edit suite and then into developing stories and creating films with deep underlying messages that reflect his very special part of the world, the Kimberley. He's collaborated with some of the greats in Australian film and television over the years and has branched out into fixing and producing for some of the larger international TV broadcasters, including BBC UK, NHK in Japan and others. He has turned his filmmaking skills in a really interesting direction, exploring Indigenous cultures and connection to country and to spirit, which is exactly what this podcast is about in essence. So he was a perfect match, a match made in heaven. We discuss Mark's trip to South America and his experience of sitting numerous Ayahuasca ceremonies and the effect that that had on his life, how that changed him, his connection to Australia, the country, the planet at large, and Indigenous Australians. I met Mark a few years ago, actually at the home of next week's guest, John Butler, musician. And Mark was sitting around one evening around the fire, and Mark was talking, just sharing his stories, sharing his take on Indigenous Australian mythology and history, as has been taught to him by Indigenous Australian community members up in his home region of the Kimberley. And I was so enthralled by what he was saying, my body started buzzing. This energy started moving through my body, and I all but fainted. I actually had to excuse myself, get off my chair and lay down on the ground as my body was shaking. It was such just a potent energy running through my body in response to what he was saying. It just resonated with me so strongly. And we've been mates ever since. His work as a filmmaker, protecting country up north, in particular the Fitzroy River. We talk about the Younger Dryas period, magnetic pole shifts, megafauna extinctions, mnemonics, ancient Egypt, psychedelics. This is a really interesting chat. So again, without further ado, my mate Mark Jones. Mark Jones, welcome to the Octarine Tree podcast. How do you do today?
Very well, thanks, mate. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been watching with bated breath as your series takes flight.
I'm really enjoying the process. I should have done it years ago. I kind of feel a bit indulgent just getting to ask interesting people the questions that I'm actually interested in asking.
It's a little bit like filmmaking. Eventually you start hanging around with, lots of scientists and Indigenous folks and all sorts of stuff, and I find myself, I'm learning all the time. That's why I love doing what I do.
Yeah, you seem to have a pretty rich experience when you're out in the field, don't you? Like, that's the impression I get, the photos you send back and the stories you tell.
I'm pretty lucky because I'm old enough now to be able to pick and choose the gigs that I get. And, after you've been doing it, I've been making films now for nearly 30 years, and you meet some pretty interesting people around the globe and, you start hanging out with a few, and it leads to rich experiences, which is, at the end of the day, that's what I'm after in this lifetime.
Me too, my friend. That's exactly what I'm after. When did you start? I mean, you were shooting for old Malcolm Douglas once upon a time. Was that your introduction to that field?
Yeah, it's funny. I just went into his crocodile park for the first time in 9 years 2 days ago. His son's back in town, so that was a walk down memory lane. I crashed into Broome in March 1992. I just finished a degree down in Perth at UWA, and the last thing I wanted to do was work in anthropology and human physiology. I was looking for some adventure. I ran out of money at the Carnarvon Hotel halfway up here and had to bludge the rest of the drive with a mate of mine, had to jump straight into work here. My sister was working at the Crocodile Park, which was owned by Malcolm Douglas, who I'd heard of. I'd certainly, like everybody else, I'd watched him as I grew up. And I met him about 6 days after I started. And, it was the start of a relationship that lasted for nearly 20 years. He passed away in 2010.
Yeah. And for those who are listening and aren't aware, probably for those outside of Australia, because I dare say most Australians will know who we're talking about, Malcolm Douglas was a filmmaker or a documentarian in sorts, but he was kind of like the precursor to Steve Irwin and out in the countryside, going deep country and just making films of him doing what he did.
Yeah. He made his first film in 1967. So he was one of the first. He was a pioneer, and he died actually editing his 50th film, it's an incredible archive, really, and thousands of hours of raw tape, which haven't been digitised, actually. I was just talking to his son about it. We need to digitise it before it gets eaten by all the rats. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll be a mean job in and of itself. So that was when you picked up a camera then, did you? Was that you just kind of stumbled into it?
Just stumbled into it. I didn't even know how to turn a camera on at the tender age of 22. I remember studying it at high school and enjoying it, but never took to it. But I was working in the filth with crocodiles for a year or so, collecting eggs and doing tours and, getting pretty rambunctious. But I kept seeing these very good-looking roosters walking in with khaki shirts and short haircuts and were hanging off them, and I thought, that's what I want to do.
Yeah, that's funny.
I kept, when they left town, I badgered Malcolm to take me on one of his trips, and he said, well, you got no experience. And I actually used a line that he used on me, and I said, well, neither did you. And he capitulated when Mitch Kelly, his then cameraman, got malaria. And so I got an invite, and we did 6 weeks along the Kimberley coast in a boat with a dog, and we made what was to be my first film, which was a 3 1-hour part series called The Kimberley Adventure. And I fell in love with camera, and I fell in love with the Kimberley and the original culture.
It's pretty easy to fall in love with the Kimberley. So you didn't grow up in the Kimberley. I remember you were born in Oxford of all places, weren't you?
I was born on the grounds of Oxford University. So
how do you get from Oxford University to Broome? Give us the in-betweens.
Kind of like Tony Abbott's and my paths are very similar.
Yeah.
Well, we're all Indigenous, I believe. And so it's interesting, isn't it? Because I've learnt with the Indigenous culture up here that where your spirit is born, where it comes through the portal is where it leaves. And so I would imagine that my spirit will actually have to go back through the grounds of Oxford University. So I've actually asked my wife to put whatever remains of me left, go and bury it in a rose garden near the Radcliffe Hospital at Oxford. My folks were some of the last 10-pound Poms. We came over in 1971. Right. I was 18 months old. Baby, I was a baby, and my brother was even younger. He was 10 months younger than me, 11 months younger. And so, my folks went through that traditional English immigrant pathway. They built a house on the outskirts of Perth in those days, which was Morley.
Yeah.
And then eventually Dad started working in the mining industry, which was starting to grow in the Pilbara in the 70s. And he got a transfer to a little place called Roban, which is quite a tragic town, really. It's where they mustered 5 tribes of Aboriginal people in the late 1800s into the one place and called it a town. And we lived there for 3.5 years. in the late 70s, right up till 1981. And that was formative. My best mate was an Aboriginal kid, and I used to knock around with him and his family, and we'd go camping at the Burrup Peninsula before there was a gas plant there. And you know, I started hearing all the old stories then. So that was really important. And then we went back to Perth. We lived in the hills of Perth for a decade or so. Went to school there and university. But I'd always been touched by the North after that experience as a kid. So I was pretty keen to get back up here as soon as I could make my own decisions. So I lobbed back up here. I lobbed into Broome, into the Kimberley in 92. So I was 22 years old. And we used to come on holidays to Broome. I remember loving it as a kid. So I was quite familiar with it.
What did you say you studied at uni?
I did a science degree. So physiology, human physiology and human movement on one side, and I did a minor in anthropology.
That came in handy, I guess.
Yeah, well, it was funny because I gravitated towards it because I was interested in it, but I never actually saw it as being a career pathway or anything like that. But it certainly gave me the grounding for then getting into ethnographic film and everything that I kind of do these days. So, yeah, it's pretty interesting how coincidental that was.
So how long did you spend tagging around after Malcolm, helping him making films?
We had a volatile relationship, Malcolm and I. I probably had 3 or 4 or 5 stand-up arguments with him, which had me leaving and taking off to Europe and to all sorts of places. But eventually I'd gravitate back and he'd invite me back and I'd do another film with him and everything else. I worked with him pretty much full on for the first 6 years, went away for a couple of years, came back for another 5 years. And then in the last sort of decade, I was certainly living up here, but we weren't working as closely together because I was off with my own career by then. I was making fishing shows and golf shows and, you know, other stuff and producing my own stuff. But, you know, I was still involved with him and I'd look after the crocodile park for him when he went away. And I was actually editing his last film when he passed away. So, yeah, he was the official photographer at our wedding in 2005, down your way, actually, down at Castle Rock, down in Dunsborough.
Is that where you met Will Thomas at the Crocodile Park?
No, I know Will from the hills.
Right.
I've known Will since we were 13, 14 years old.
Right.
We lived in the same area in Darlington. He went to some hippie school down in Guildford and I was off at the state school, which was, you know, a little bit more rough and tumble. And so that's why he's a lot more of a thespian than I am.
Yeah, he does. For a bloke who's that rough around the edges, he does kind of carry himself like a thespian, doesn't he? Frolicking around.
He's very theatrical is our William.
And so when did you head to South America?
I was heavily involved with the James Price Point campaign up here, and we did a very cool story with the Australian newspaper owned by our very own Rupert Murdoch. We got to know the journalist, the environmental editor and his partner, and they came up and they ran a story up here on what was to be the smallest dolphin in the world.
Species of?
Yeah.
Right.
It's tentatively called the diminutive dolphin. It's only about 3 foot long.
Is this just speculated as a species?
No. We actually shot 18 of them, not with a bullet, but with a dart, with a cetacean mate of mine, Dr. Simon Allen, who works at Murdoch University. He specialises in getting samples from dolphins.
Right.
And you pop these little darts into their skin and it pulls out a little bit of subcutaneous fat, which they then run through their machines over in Europe. And it is scientifically a new species of dolphin and smallest dolphin.
But up until that point, was it not recognised by science?
Well, of course, Woodside with James Price Point were doing this marine science paper. Cost them $80 million, and it was to be the Bible on everything science in the marine systems around Broome and the Kimberley, which would then feed into, you know, the narrative about where to put gas plants and everything else. But of course, they were manipulating the science, as often happens, and they were only allowing the planes to fly at 1,000 feet, not 500 feet. And at 1,000 feet, a small dolphin looks like a mullet. And so the scientists that were recording that were very sure that it was a new species, and they kept reporting it to Woodside, but Woodside said that they were juvenile bottlenose and humpback dolphins. And so they asked their friend Simon Allen, my mate, if he could have a look. And he's a bit of a renegade. He's a bit of a truth seeker. So he just phoned me up and said, Jonesy, can you get hold of a plane and a boat and some money, and can we go out and have a look off James Price Point? And we did. It took us a week to find the dolphins, and then we spent 3 days with them getting samples and scientifically proved that it was not straight away, but it was interesting because the Australian newspaper was with us and they reported that in their national paper, and the Environment Minister at the time, Tony Burke, was able to take that article and put it on Woodside's desk and say, what the hell's going on here? And it was one of the big changes in that campaign. So to go back to your original question, the couple that I was working with from the Australian were talking to me about some projects that they were doing in Peru and some of the other experiences that they were doing with plants and everything else. I had been asking some deep questions for a very long time and looking under all sorts of rocks, trying to find these answers in books. I was looking everywhere, and my ears pricked up when they started talking, and took me 18 months to research ayahuasca and the people that I was going with to feel comfortable with it. And then the following year, so that's 2013, is when I flew from Broome to Iquitos in Peru, which took me 3 days. And then I stayed in Peru for 40 days and 40 nights.
That's a poignant period of time.
Yes, well, that's I wanted it to be that. So I lobbed in there. My wife, actually, thankfully, my wife went in with me. She only stayed for 5 days, and then she went off trekking up in Machu Picchu. But I'm so glad that she did come in, because she did 2 of the ayahuasca ceremonies at the beginning, and I reckon if she hadn't, I doubt that we'd still be married. But thankfully she did, and so she's completely understood the process that has gone on since then.
Yeah, so you say that because you were so affected that you don't think, had she not made that experience as well, she just wouldn't have understood where you had gone and who and what you'd become in the process?
That's right. It completely, I mean, you hear it all the time with everybody that does it. It completely changed me, and it completely changed the way I viewed the world. The first 2 years afterwards were incredible, but also very confusing. Sometimes you felt like you were losing your mind, because you look at the world in a very different way, and there was a lot of torment going on trying to understand it, but also all this other stuff that was happening afterwards. And I think if my wife hadn't have been through it and hadn't have understood it, then that would have led to much frustration from both sides. But
right. So that's a significant integration period, to call it that. A couple of years of things being a bit wobbly and just getting used to the new pair of eyes that you had.
Yeah, and I think too, when you've had an experience like that, you see it a lot with people when they've had that revelation that they're after. The first thing they want to do is tell everybody about it, not because of ego. In fact, it's the opposite. They want everybody else to go through the same profound experience that they will have. But of course, that's not what happens. You come back and everybody looks at you rather strangely and says, all sorts of strange things. So I actually had to find myself actually stop talking about it, because I was bringing attention to myself. So I actually did. I went inside myself for a long time. But now I've sort of processed it, and I'm able to vocalize what happened a lot better and also integrate it into my life.
What was the core fundamental takeaway from those experiences?
That we're split into two. We're split into spirit and ego, and we have allowed ego to take over and run ourselves and our world, and it's ego that takes us into these dark places that we find both individually and as a group, as society. The moment that you're shown your ego and you battle with your ego in that, and you realise that no longer does your ego run you, but other more powerful forces, is an incredible moment. It's the moment that you realise that you do have a body that serves you for this life, and then you leave that body and you go on more adventures. You learn about the immortality of your soul, the great question that humanity has always asked itself.
That's a wonderful place to arrive at during an experience like that. But am I right to guess? I've never tried ayahuasca. I've dabbled in my fair share of psychedelics, organic compounds and otherwise, but ayahuasca is something I've never tried. It strikes me as being a pretty damn intense experience, and an intense experience amongst intense experiences. That sounds like a great place to arrive at, but I'm pretty damn sure that the whole journey, the whole experience itself wasn't all love and light and roses. There would have been some pretty challenging moments.
Oh my God, the whole thing was. I remember actually getting off the plane after 3 days sleeping in airports, and then getting into Iquitos, the largest city in the world, not accessed by a road. And then we jump on this bus, and it's that typical South American scene with chickens and shit everywhere. And you're driving down the road, this one road, about 80 kilometres out from the city, and you're surrounded by the Amazon River and water, and then we get to this sort of jungle setting, and there's this little path, and we all get out with our backpacks and these big boots, and we start sloshing through the jungle to this camp that we're going to be staying at for the first 2 weeks. And I remember turning around to my wife and I said, in a journey of 100 miles, consider 99 halfway, which was said by Sun Tzu, the famous philosopher, Chinese philosopher. Here's me thinking that I'm being profound, because that was the beginning of the journey, and it wasn't until the very end when I realised that 99 miles was right at the end. It was torture. It's not a sane pursuit. You pay pretty good money to get over there and get through the whole thing. You pay to throw up at least 15 times a night for the first 2 weeks. I lost 12 kilos. Physically, it was absolutely exhausting. Spiritually, it was absolutely exhausting. But it has to be, the whole process has to be for you to then learn the lessons of it on the other side. But it was torture. It was torture for 2 years afterwards. Yeah, it's hard work.
Do you remember arriving back in Australia after that experience?
I don't, to be honest with you.
Okay.
No, I don't. It's very hard for me to remember that first week back. It was a really full-on experience. I remember that, but I don't remember much of it.
I remember I visited Egypt, and I'd done this amazing tour up and down the Nile and river cruises and visiting temples and whatnot, and it was incredible. And while I was there, I was reading this book by, some people will recognize the author of Drunvalo Melchizedek, The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life, which had just landed in my lap when I was in Egypt. And it's all about the kind of symbolist and esoteric view of Egypt. And I remember pulling up to the Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau and doing this little, just taking a moment's silence and a little bit of a moment to set some intentions. And I said something like, I was appreciating the gravity or potential gravity of what I was about to do and walk into this building that I've always wanted to visit and that I have very strong suspicions as to its function. And I said to myself, may this experience assist me in being the purest version of myself and providing the greatest possible good to the greatest many, something to that effect. And I got my ass kicked. I remember the rest of the trip through Egypt, it was a few days and that was pleasant enough. But upon return to Australia, I entered a couple of years of being really disorientated and feeling like I was having my soul scrubbed clean with a wire brush. Now, I don't know what to attribute it to. You know, I'm not insisting that it was connected, but we often kind of underestimate how much effort and discomfort there is in spiritual growth. You know, the whole new age scene where it's all love and light and fluff, it ain't like that.
I completely agree with you. It's actually quite the opposite. I think anything to do with growth requires a fair bit of pain and mishap. Absolutely. Yeah, and I've experienced that. I've experienced that firsthand. Yeah, it took me a long time to actually to really work through what I'd been through, and then to actually then find my place back in society and start navigating it and everything else, and also using what I learned, you know, for my own benefit, for this life.
Yeah, because I mean, some people go to South America, or indeed, it's moved around the world now, ayahuasca. I was lucky enough I was in California, staying with a dear friend of mine who's an anthropologist, and her husband was doctor to the stars in the Hollywood Hills. And he said, jump in the car, I'm going to take you somewhere interesting. We zoomed off up into Topanga Valley to this kind of mansion built into the hill, and there was, 30, 40, 50 people there in the big living room entrance hall thing of this mansion. And it was the North American ayahuasca practitioners get together. I can't remember what the name of the society was, but that was what they did. And I believe it was the first time they'd ever all gotten together. And there were all these kind of gurus of the scene sitting around taking turns talking, and they were wrapping it up. And there was a bit of a murmuring from the back, and then someone comes forward, says, can we just take a minute now? There's someone who wants to say something. And this guy in English announces that there's this young man from like deep Amazon, from the border of Peru and Brazil, who had come there. He'd been sent there, not invited. No one knew he was arriving, but he'd been sent there to speak to them. And it's an amazing looking individual. He was only about, 4'5", 5 foot, and just the most incredible bone structure and skin. He proceeded to speak in Portuguese to this guy who translated. And ostensibly he was saying, hello, my name is so-and-so, and I come from the border of Peru and Brazil, and my people call ourselves the people who are still true to reality. And we've been working with Mother Ayahuasca since the beginning of time, and I'm here to assist in the dissemination of her medicine throughout the world right now, because the modern world has lost its connection to soul and to spirit.
I actually, so that the couple that I actually met with the Dolphin, who was my introduction to ayahuasca, it was quite strange actually, because we'd finished the adventure looking for the Dolphin, and then it was their last night, and we took them to a local beach here. It's a women's beach, very significant beach, Seven Sisters story. Mm-hmm. And we were down there just saying our goodbyes, and the woman, journalist's partner, came up to me and she said, Mark, this is going to sound very strange. We don't know each other super well, but I've been pointed to come here and meet you, and I have been told to tell you to keep your message clear. Mm. And You know, I've grown up in the country. I'm a bit of a country boy, so those sorts of things, you know, my ears prick up and I start getting a bit sus and everything else. And I didn't really know what she meant by it. I did ask her. She said she couldn't explain. And I reckon it took me 4 years after Peru to actually then start to understand what she was saying to me then. I think profound things happen around those very, very ancient ceremonies, especially I hear a lot of the ayahuasca ceremonies that are done in, you know, the cities and everything else, and that the person that administers it, usually a Western shaman, they become the hero of the ceremonies, and a lot of people that are doing the ceremonies with these Western shamans actually have this adoration, a bit like a cult.
Yeah.
And I often ask the people that have done it, I said, is there any mention of trees in the ceremony? Is there any mention in the songs about the trees? Did the shamans talk about the trees? Anything? And they all say no. And as soon as they say that, then I know that it's being run by charlatans and not shamans, because I was very fortunate. I went into the jungles of the Pacaya Samiria National Park for 2.5 weeks, and we lived actually in the jungle. We had to cut the jungle with machetes. We had pink river dolphins going past us every day. We had howler monkeys waking us up in the morning. It was like a Tarzan movie, and we lived in that jungle, in amongst those trees, doing those ceremonies, and told the Dreamtime stories of those ceremonies by the Shipibo people, proper countrymen. So I was very, very lucky to have the authentic experience, which I'm told does not happen very often.
I think there is something to what this young Peruvian man said, in that ayahuasca is being disseminated around the planet as a medicine. It is time for that. In saying that, though, I don't know if I would partake of it outside of its home ground.
That's the same. I wouldn't take it. I wouldn't take it outside of where the plant grows, and it's the same with any of those plants. To be honest with you, I'm pretty loyal to where those plants are and the ceremonies, because it's all intertwined.
Yeah.
You take those plants, then the master trees actually are the conveners of the ceremony and take you on these journeys of insight.
I actually planted a vine, the Banisteriopsis copi, the other day in Perth. But a friend's place, a strange horticultural job in a medicinal garden, but that's another story. So, and we actually have, I mean, in terms of the actual brew of ayahuasca, that's a DMT-rich plant substance, which is then mixed with an MAO inhibitor, which allows it to be digested in the stomach and not broken down and reuptaken too quickly. So, and we have them in Australia. There are, I think it's Acacia acuminata. Forgive me, this might be slightly off, but I believe Acacia acuminata, which is a West Australian species of acacia, is the highest concentration of and purest forms of DMT alkaloids known in the plant kingdom.
Any of the plants that you see on the state logos are powerful. I think any of the symbolism that you see with the laurel leaves in Roman symbolism, all of the fleur-de-lis with France, all of those plants that were lionized, if you don't have to do too much scratching to see that they were ceremonial plants previously, that then, like everything else, were turned into symbols.
Yeah.
And the symbols became adored.
Yeah.
I think of two things when I hear you say that. One is that plants are women's law, something that we know very little about. I think you'll find in the deep stories that men did covet the recipes of certain plants, and you'll find around Australia. And in fact, I go for a bushwalk this afternoon, and I walk past this, we call it Strangler Vine. It's one of those June vines. Mm-hmm. And that flower was very important in certain ceremonies. And in the deep story, the man strangles the woman with her vine. And, you know, the woman, the plant, and the serpent, those reoccurring themes are in all creation stories. The second thing is that there is a deep knowledge about the plants, but it's the stories and the poetry that we don't understand. So, you know, that film that we just saw of mine the other day, and the magic modula tree.
Yeah.
In the deep stories, when you get to certain initiate levels, you'll find that that tree isn't just a tree that's powerful and can, you know, has painkillers in it. You'll actually start to find that if you prepare that tree in a certain way, then you can go on the visions, which Bull did in the film. So in these deep stories, it can tell you how to prepare the plants and go on these vision quests. And the third thing is, again, another deep story, the emu and the plum, which is painted all through the Kimberley here, deep story, and that goes all the way to Victoria, the emu and the plum story, and its symbolism actually is probably on Göbekli Tepe and a few other places. That story is about a certain plum called Galani, which here means the tree of life, and in Hebrew also means the tree of life. And if you wait until the first lightning storm with the release of the liberation of nitrogen and all those goodies, that fires up that tree, the Galani tree, and that's when the people go in and they harvest that plum. It's a certain plum.
Right.
And then they dry that plum out and then they crush it up into a great big round ball of pulp. And then they go and put that into the cave, and then they come back a year later, and like ergot, it has films of fungus and things that we don't know, we don't even know exist.
Right.
And so there's some really interesting scientific work being done by the rock art dating team that I'm following that are finding these glazes on the rock surfaces in the caves, and those glazes are full of calcium oxalate, which is what your mate Brian Malcheski, is it? The guy that did the...
Brian Muir-esque.
Yeah, he talks about calcium oxalates in the vases and everything at Göbekli Tepe, which are plant resins. And it's the same. We're finding that we have glazes here that have these plant resins from things that were left for a period of time and then used in the ceremony.
A fermentation process.
That's right, yeah.
That's really interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so I think we've got a lot to learn here, and we actually have to have our ears attuned so we can actually start to find out the recipes that they did use here. Also in the Kimberley, out of the hundreds of thousands of motifs that we have here, 28% of them are plant motifs, and all of those plant motifs are the grasses and the seeds that were grounded for fermentation. The lily bulbs, all of them were full of alkaloids and DMTs that we used. So then you start to realise that they might not have been having an ayahuasca ceremony, but they were living in a continual chemical relationship with plants and the things that they were consuming. And the animals were plant eaters that they were consuming as well, and they coveted the livers of the kangaroo, the emu, the turtle, the dugong, who ate the seagrasses full of DMT, and it was the liver that was full of the chemistry as well. So, and that's when you could have dreams of being that dugong, because you are actually literally taking on these beautiful cocktails of chemicals that we can't eat ourselves or consume ourselves. We need another animal to do it for us. Yeah,
that's fascinating. It reminds me of the stories of the Siberian and Laplander, the shamans of the boreal peoples up in the north, that they would watch the reindeer eat the Amanita muscaria, and then watch where the reindeers piss and then go eat the yellow snow.
That's exactly right. There's a great book called Intoxication, which documents 400 species of animals that seek out intoxication. And I would suggest, just in my anecdotal watching of the world go by, all the beetles that come in the first rains of the wet season, they are all smashing all the fermenting fruits and everything else and flying into our houses and flying into us in this cocktail-induced state. I'd say that it's something that happens a lot, and I'd say that what's interesting in my ayahuasca experience, I always knew I would drink and then I'd go into this meditation, and then I knew that I was going into the visions, because the first thing that happened was a dragonfly would land on my shoulder, and the stories around insects and fermenting plants and the Lord of the Flies and, you know, all of these things. I think that there was a fair bit of ceremonial stuff going on, not just with human beings. I think it happens right throughout the animal kingdom.
Really? That's bloody interesting as well.
Well, I was shown ayahuasca vines in the jungle, which were teeth cleaning stations of the jaguar, which of course is front and center in any of the ayahuasca ceremonies. You always see the jaguars. You see all sorts of things, but jaguars are always there. All the cats are highly spiritual animals. They clean their teeth on the ayahuasca vines. They are consuming now. Whether they're taking it with the inhibitor and everything else, I don't know. But there is the tribal people say that the jaguar consumes ayahuasca.
Wow.
And I actually saw the teeth cleaning stations on the vine. So I think there's a fair bit of it going on.
I once watched a fox eat an Amanita muscaria mushroom.
Wow.
In the pine forest in Margaret River, sitting there silently, and I had a brief moment of like tension going, oh my God, I've never wanted to film anything more in my life. But if I pull my phone out of my pocket, it's over. So I was just like, I can either document this or I can just sit there and watch it. And I chose the latter.
Yeah.
But it would have been a great little bit of footage.
Absolutely.
Today's episode of the Octarine Tree is brought to you by Facebook. Should be working, but instead Facebook. Traffic lights have turned red, Facebook. Got 5 minutes, take a shit, Facebook. Facebook, Facebook, Facebook. Facebook. Authorized by the Labor Handler.
So did you find that your relationship to country had changed upon your return? Were you seeing country or feeling it differently?
I always had a pull towards it, obviously. I always was very sympathetic to it. I was already starting to receive a lot of information back then, but I think there was a block. When I look back on it now, there was a block because I had not had that experience, and so I was willing myself to have this deep understanding. But I think it wasn't until I'd done the plant ceremonies that I then completely looked at everything differently, whether it was the earth, whether it was the things that lived on the earth, whether it was my relationships, all those sorts of things. So I think by having that experience coming back, what happened was I was able to come back into the Indigenous cultures I live with here. I was able to come back and start asking the right questions. And when you ask the right questions, then you get the answers that you're looking for. If you ask daft questions, you don't get an answer.
Yeah, okay.
That's what I found. I was able to go back to the old men and the old women that I knew, and I said to them, I've had this experience and this is what happened to me. And they understood it because they had lived with it. And so then they were able to then guide me. And I was shown so much more after the experience.
Yeah, okay. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
You mentioned a little earlier your film, The Serpent's Tail, that I was lucky enough to see the other night. I was at the opening in Perth, which was amazing. And you were joined by a panel of Indigenous Australians, a couple from the Perth area and a whole bunch that had come down from the Kimberley. Would you speak for a moment to the premise of that film? Because that's a really important one regarding the Fitzroy.
Yeah, so it's the second film that I've done. They're just very small films done on very small budgets, but they're campaign films. But they're not the traditional campaign film where a lefty is hoisting up their flag saying, stop this. Rather than do that and make a film that just attracts, people that already believe in it, I was interested in making a positive film about the creation stories of the 6 tribes that live along the river and shine a light on something that is really little understood in our country, and the ties that the Aboriginal people have to those stories. And that if you stop telling those stories, then you lose your culture. And if you lose your culture, you're nothing. And we can see that. We can see that in Aboriginal communities and towns and cities all over Australia. I don't need to go into that story. So I was approached nearly 3 years ago, actually. It was just before my mum died. It was pretty hectic time. It was a really hectic time. It was a hell of a journey. I was approached to make a film on the origin stories of the Fitzroy River, and I said, well, you know, am I the right person? I'm a white fella for a start. And but the council, who those elders were, the Matawara Council, insisted that I make the film. And then so I started to ask, you know, about the stories of the river, and I was getting all of these disparate stories, which I was trying to understand, but the central themes kept coming through: the serpent, the magical tree, and the spring, which is laced even through our Western creation stories, which I've been fascinated with since I came back from Peru. I had no inclination towards reading the Bible or the Torah or the Quran or any of those things pre-Peru. Since I've come back, I have ravenously read everything, and I start to see that the symbolism that are in the creation stories of religion are very similar to the symbols that are connected to Indigenous cultures around the world, which are much, much older. But in the Indigenous cultures, those symbols are seen as being positive, powerful, good things, whereas in Christianity, for example, the serpent, the tree, and the spring are demonised, and that becomes the foundation stone, if you like, for Western civilization. So I'm really interested in those old stories and how this new story has been flipped on its head, and how Indigenous people then became so easily conned by religion because they were familiar with the symbols.
Yeah, I mean, the Christianity is a classic example of adopting pagan symbols.
That's what I was attracted to. That's what I was attracted to, was telling a story about those early symbols, but, you know, in a positive way, to make people that watch the film go, I wonder why the serpent is good in Aboriginal culture but is a devil in Christianity.
Well, because you hear, like, our culture, modern industrialized culture is the term I usually go to. In industrialized culture and its immediate predecessing forms, the reptiles, and to be reptilian is to be considered cold and lacking feeling and calculating and almost machine-like. But you find the serpent in particular in many non-industrialized cultures, it's almost maternal.
The serpent is immortality. And you also learn that when you go into Peru and do the ayahuasca work with the Shipibo, where you are actually visited by serpents. Yeah. You know, all of the mythology around Jonah being swallowed by a whale. A whale used to be a worm, Wynmrh, which translates to serpent. In all of the deep stories, you'll hear of these characters that are swallowed by whales, serpents, and dragons. Well, that's what happens to you in these plant ceremonies. If it's the right plant, the serpent comes to you, which again is in all the symbolism around the world. But the serpent comes to you, and then eventually it swallows you, and you go on this journey. You are taken to be shown, you know, that journey. And actually, even Serpent's Tail, William, when he first, it wasn't in the film, I was asked to leave it out, but in the film, in the story, William actually is swallowed by the serpent when he goes on his vision quest and creates the Fitzroy River. So, you know, that, and when you're swallowed by the serpent, when they're taken by the whale and everything else, that is when you realise that you live in a mortal body, but your soul is immortal, and you understand what immortality is.
Mm. Okay. Hey, are you able to talk about your other project that's in the works? That's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're very excited. This started 5 years ago. A film, the working title is called Stories in Stone, and it's about all of these things that we're talking about. It's about symbolism. It's about ancient rock art here. It's about this being completely unique in the planet, because not only do we have the largest art galleries in situ in the world, but we also have people still alive and ethnographies that have stories attached to that artwork. And so we're able to translate a lot of what the art is telling us. And if you actually can break down the beautiful poetic way that it's told and translate it into more of a pragmatic scientific language for a greater audience, you can actually start to see that human prehistory and its art is defined by a great climactic upheaval.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start to realise that that's what's going on here, then you can take that key and you can take it to other places around the world. So we visit Stonehenge with Dr. Lynn Kelly, who's written the Memory Code.
Yeah.
We'll go to Brittany. We'll go to Serpent Hill in Ohio. We'll go to Peru. You know, we'll go to all of these places and we'll look at serpent imagery and we'll look at the tree iconography and you know, the cenotes in Chichen Itza in Mexico and, you know, all of that. And we'll be able to show that the stories that were told here were the same stories that were told in other parts of the world way back when. And then their story slowly gets bastardised as agriculture sweeps through. I know that it's probably a point of debate here in this nation, but we really are the only nation or the only land the only country that never absorbed agriculture like agriculture is practiced with canals and clearing land and planting things in a row.
Yeah.
It was actively resisted here, which means that the original stories then were able to live very, very long because there wasn't the warfare that comes with all of those byproducts from agriculture.
That's very interesting. We could spend an hour talking about that alone. I've got a deep interest in that. This concept of it, I've long thought to myself, and others have said, that we are an amnesiac species. We don't know who we are.
Yeah.
We've forgotten who we are. Some people will claim it's by design, you know, a greater kind of cosmological design. Others suggest that there was at least one cataclysm rendering us a traumatized species. And instead of just being able to live and live well and function as we are designed or meant to, or, you know, ideally could be, we're actually dealing with these traumas constantly, and traumas like deep racial, genetic, cultural-wide, species-wide trauma that is bad enough in and of itself, but the fact that we actually aren't aware that it's there, we don't even recognize this forgetting that's occurred. And it feels to me like all of the things I've been interested in personally, you know, history, anthropology, you know, the occult, theology, cosmology, all of it, I feel like in my experience, it's me being pulled toward a greater understanding of a particular story.
Yeah.
And it's a really bloody important one. In fact, as grandiose and as it sounds, I can't think of a more important story.
Yeah.
And it feels like now, like we're getting somewhere, you know, it feels like there are puzzle pieces that are slowly falling into place now.
Yeah. I think there's lots of breadcrumbs.
Mm.
And I think that if we listen to the old stories here, that the oldest story thus far proven by Professor Dwayne Hummaker, geomorphologist, is 37,500-year-old story in Victoria. There's speculation that Seven Sisters story, which you and I have talked about a lot,
Mm-hmm.
there's speculation that story is much, much older. I'd probably argue that, but that's a long conversation. I would suggest it's more around that 40 to 45,000 year range, which we were talking about the other day with what was going on with the magnetic.
Yeah, the recent article that was put out suggesting that around 42,000 years ago there was a pole shift.
Yeah. So I think if you actually have the ability to be able to go back and look at those old stories and start to disseminate those old stories, is pretty interesting. But I also think it's really interesting when you actually look at some of the old stories in our creation story. For example, the flood story and Noah.
Yeah.
The first thing that Noah does after his ark rests on Mount Sinai in the Taurus Mountains.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing he does is he plants a vine.
Mm.
And in that story it says that he plants a vine and then he becomes drunk.
Mm.
And of course we think of that in our minds as he planted a grapevine, he made some wine, and he just got
He gets pissed.
That's actually not what it's about. It's about him bringing back a very sacred plant on a great voyage in a thing called an ark, which is what the new ark also had. It had some very important plants in it as well. And the first act that he does is to plant that vine, and then it specifically says he gets naked, which of course is what Indigenous cultures were doing all of the time. And he gets drunk, and then Ham, his son, the first thing he does is embarrassed by his father, and he dresses him. And it's that story, those couple of sentences are so important because it gives you an idea of how Noah thought that to go back to the old culture with the vine and that ceremony was what humanity needed to do after the flood. But he was corrected by his son, and they went straight back into the corrupted ways, and it was on for young and old. So I think there's a lot of the pieces of the jigsaw in the old, even in the old Western stories. I love Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
You've heard me talking about.
Yeah.
I love Gilgamesh, and in Gilgamesh, there's so many important clues in there, and ultimately Gilgamesh is denied the plant of life. It was taken back by the serpent in a spring, and he was denied that plant. Therefore, he was denied immortality, and therefore we are mortal beings. I can't remember exactly word for word what he says, but he says we are mortal beings and we're here to fill our boots, which has been the mantra ever since we have become mortal beings 11,600 years ago, when we decided to leave our relationship with nature and those plant ceremonies and everything else that some mobs are still doing, but they're very few and far between, and they've been marginalised. But I think you're right. I think we're now looking backwards to try and understand who we are as human beings, because it's sure as hell not driving around electric cars in the orbit of the Earth.
Yeah, no, I've said before that I have a strong suspicion that the majority of the pathologies that we experience as a species, whether the psychological, emotional, and even physical, have their root in a lack of meaningful connection to country and to spirit.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I mean, that's vague. That's a vague thing to say, but I believe it.
Yeah, no. Well, I believe that as well. I think I personally think that Adam and Eve weren't the first human beings. I believe that they were the last human beings.
Yeah,
they were the last human beings that were indigenous, that were allowed to enjoy a plant ceremony that is still enjoyed today. It's a plant ceremony that's probably been going on for hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah,
I would suggest that it's probably the reason why our brains have increased in size and faculty, because of the chemistry that's going on with the alchemy as we were heating plants and boiling plants and understanding how to manipulate the pharmacology.
The old stoned ape theory.
And I think that I think that something happens 12,800 years ago. Yeah, I think something happens, and I think most of humanity gets wiped out in the Northern Hemisphere 12,800 years ago, which creates that amnesia that you're talking about. And I think that here in the Southern Hemisphere, in certain places like the Kimberley, whilst there was great upheaval here, and we can see that because the art epochs of the Goyon period just stopped. Bang! They stopped painting humans forever after 12,800 years ago.
So the Guion, known as the Bradshaw art?
Yeah. And those, the later stages of that art, you can see this de-evolution in the art going and war, which then culminates with flood stories and cataclysm, and then eventually they go back to painting serpents, plants, and animals, which they had not painted for at least 6,000 years.
So they were affected here, but they managed to hold on to the old ways greater than they did in the Northern Hemisphere. Is that what I'm hearing?
They were able to hold on to the old ways, and they had a historical record of art, jumba, dance, that is art, dance and story, which allowed them to be cohesive and still retain stories that were older than the younger tribes.
Forever, it seems, people have been racking their minds to figure out the root cause of the human condition. To me, it's blatantly obvious that there is a deep pathology within our species, and it's a huge discussion as to what that is and where it comes from. But I mean, can you imagine a world if and when we finally crack the code, and it may be many, many different puzzle pieces put together, but we finally figure out how we work and we get our hands on the kind of the control mechanism, and we're able to heal that. So we're at least empty of shit and functioning properly. You know, just what the things that we could create as a collective and as a planet, I think is, you know, it's incredible for sci-fi fantasy stuff.
So to wheel back to your original question, which I digressed with, about our new project. Our new project is ultimately, it's about taking all of humanity, and that's why we want this to be a global film. We want a lot of people to see this film, because we want to walk people by the hand back into their prehistory and have a look at what it meant to be human then, and how far we've digressed, and what's right and what's wrong. Because ultimately, in the last 11,600 years, every civilization that has ever been created has collapsed, and yet the indigenous cultures have still persevered. So when Jesus Christ said, "The meek shall inherit the earth," I'm pretty sure what he was saying was that the indigenous people inherit the earth because they know how to survive through younger dryas, whatever happened 42,000 years ago, whatever happened 4,200 years ago with the 4.2 Ka event. All of these are well documented in the art history and in the stories and the songs, and they just have to sing their way through the song lines to understand how to survive through those things. And there's not many people outside of those societies that could. When you don't have a book with writing this is outsourcing knowledge. This is what I'm starting to come to the realisation with. We outsource our knowledge. We've got it in books. We've now got it in our phones and computers and everything else. It's outside of us. Whereas in Indigenous culture, it was all in here. And as you get older, the songs that you learn as a kid have added more and more layers to that song.
Layer of meaning.
Once you know those songs, then you're able to sing yourself around your estate from water point to water point, and from, you know, and in between there's animals that you hunt, and flowers and plant ceremonies and all of those sorts of things. But if you know where all your water points are through the springs, which is why they're so revered, and we built pyramids and churches over the top of those springs, but it was about the springs and where the water came up. If you knew intimately where those water points were and where the animals were, you could survive. And so if you then go and create a 5-dimensional map, which is song, dance, art, and story, that is inside those song lines, which are inside your mind, then you no longer outsource your information. It all comes back into here, and you can do anything you like. So no longer are we then defined by the house that we live in or the area that we're in or the shirt or anything like that. You're a completely different being.
Yeah. You've cultivated your being to be everything you need. You haven't outsourced any of those mechanisms or applications.
That's exactly right. So, what we think is a human being now is very, very different to what a human being was in Europe 12,800 years ago. So our definition of who and what we are also has to change. And I don't know, I think that I don't like the word history, because history is his story. It is everything that's happened in the Holocene, and I don't trust it. I think that the answers lay before the Holocene, when the story is very, very different, and it wasn't run so much by men as it was women. And I think when the responsibility of spirituality and being is left in the hands of women, then we are in far more safer hands than what we have now. And we can see it. We can see it everywhere.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly. Mark Jones, that was awesome. You've given me a few extra leads to follow up. I'm going to leave you to it now, because it's getting wobbly on my end. You're sounding a little bit like a digital chipmunk every kind of 10 seconds.
Yeah, it gets pretty busy here in the Arvo.
Could you really quickly, mate, you just let people know where they can go to sniff out your work further?
Yes, I just got invited by the State Library, actually, to archive all my stuff, which is a hell of an honour.
Awesome.
Yeah, so everywhere. I've got stuff everywhere. So the last big feature doco I was involved with, which was Undermined, is on, I think it's on Netflix. I've got Old Country, New Country is on YouTube. Serpent's Tail is just about to do film festivals and NITV, SBS. The new project, Stories in Stone, it's looking, hopefully, fingers crossed, it looks like it's going to be ABC here in Australia and have a global release. So I do stories that are small and for Aboriginal PBCs just up the road, and I'm also involved in big stuff. So it's kind of scattered everywhere.
For those listening, I was lucky enough to have a look at the teaser trailer for Stories in Stone, and it was so far up my alley, I nearly shat myself. I'm really looking forward to that one, mate. It looks really good.
Yeah, well, thankfully the broadcasters and the agents and everybody else are excited. I think it's time.
Yeah.
I think it's time for shit like this. And I think since Peru, I realised that, my job in this on this mortal coil is to pump out stuff as I see it and take people back to the source. And if that happens and we manage to protect a bit of country along the way, then I'll die with a smile on my face.
Well said. Awesome. All right, Mark Jones, thank you so much for joining us.
Good on you, mate. Thanks, mate.
All right. Speak soon.
See ya.
Ta-da, mate. See ya.
Drives you crazy, and in the hoarding of the pie right in your bed, you live the hard way, all that's golden glitters. So let's start a blacksmith fire and forge your ticket to the other side. so let your ribs speak for you, friend. I know that trading all that fool's gold keeps you hungry. So let's start a blacksmith fire and forge your ticket to the other side. If God loves a broken hunger strike, so let your ribs speak for you, friend. You learn the hard way, all that's gold and glitters, but not the same on the other side, I guess. He's been dying for a whole half-life, and his golden ribs will testify why. I'll be smelting all that pyrite in your bed. Your bed, my friend, my friend. So let's start a blacksmith fire and forge your ticket to the other side. The God loves a broken hunger strike, so let your ribs speak for you, friend. You learn the hard way, all that's gold and glitters, but not the same on the other side, I guess. He's been dying for a whole half-life, and his golden ribs will testify why. I'll be smelting all that pyrite in your bed. Your bed. Your bed. My friend.